Hello, hello, everybody, and welcome back to another episode of That Inner Voice podcast. I'm your host, Jennifer McKenzie, the conscious living coach and owner of Lunar Spirit Wellbeing. Today, I'm joined by Edy Nathan from New York City.
That's right. Hi. Good to be
Hi.
here.
Thank you so much for coming on. And for the listeners and watchers, would you like to introduce yourself? And everybody, if you're listening on the audio or you're watching on YouTube, do not forget to subscribe, like, and share. You never know who you're going to help just with a click of a button. So, welcome, Edy. So, if you'd just like to tell everyone, who are you? What do you do? And why do you do it?
We could spend so much time talking about what I do and why I do it. And I work with grief. I work with all different kinds of grief, and I see grief as kind of the umbrella under which all of us travel. And we travel with our grief in many different ways. It can certainly be the loss of a loved one, or the loss of a home, or the loss of a limb, or the loss of the role of being a caretaker. And I call them the big G's and the little G's. The thing that I love to say is that I help people realize that once they've been touched by grief, however it comes in, that it's a journey. It's a hero shiro journey that forever changes them, and they move from that ordinary life. Everything was going along, and I'm just doing great, and everything changes. Who they are, what they know shifts, and they end up kind of moving into like the cave, the depth of emotion. And I really help to understand and curate what happens in that cave and the shadows and the darknesses that we meet.
Mhm. Wow, that's some great work. So when we talk about grief, for when I first sort of heard the word, I would also always associate grief with the loss of somebody rather than, but it can be, like you said, like lots of different things, kind of a breakdown of a relationship, a loss of a job, a home, even a loss of yourself. I've grieved parts of myself that I've lost. And it's something that's avoided, do you think? Like talking about grief and loss.
It is definitely avoided.
Mm,
We don't want to look at it. We don't want to see it.
mm,
Uh, uh, sadly, this pandemic has put all of us, and I'm going to say all of us because just the very nature of pandemic, there's no one on this earth that has gone unaffected by whatever has happened, because of the pandemic.
mhm,
Taking ourselves on, realizing, wow, I might be an introvert, but if I can't go outside and I'm stuck in a
mhm,
300 square foot apartment in New York City, this is not good for me either. And I need to figure out ways to have some communication with the outside world. And though I love to take myself inside of myself, I also need the experience of the world. And this pandemic has taught so many about grief, about their own loss of self, or a reorganization of the self, which
mm,
means a letting go and a retrieval, or a redefining, or a what I call, and it's not my term, it's actually a beautiful term from Japanese Buddhism, which is Shoshin, the beginner's mind. And we
mm.
must have like a beginner's mind, or maybe it just kind of comes to us, this beginner's mind of, I'm going to take this and I'm going to be curious because I don't know what's next.
Mm. And do you find that people, from your experience, are uncomfortable with not knowing what's next? That's certainly what I see.
Yeah, the discomfort of not knowing
Mm,
can send some folks into a place that just is so uncomfortable, creates anxiety or sadness or depression. And actually, those are all parts of the phases of grief that I talk about in actually my book. It's
yeah.
grief. And it is a dance of self-discovery. And the self-discovery is often about leaving something and then finding something. And that's the paradigm of grief, that there's a loss. And what is a loss but a yearning for something that you can't get back. And
Mm.
and yet it is also perhaps a desire to find out a new path, to
Mm.
find that new path, to reorganize how you're living your life.
Mm. Mm. Have you had your own experiences with grief and loss?
It is grief and loss and trauma that lands me in this seat.
Hmm.
And not that, you know, again, no one kind of is ever untouched by grief. We might want to try to ignore it. We might want to try to say, oh, well, maybe there is that 500-pound grief gorilla in the room, but I'm just going to continue to walk around it. I'm going to try to climb up and pretend that it's not there. But meanwhile, it is there.
Hmm.
And my grief, loss, trauma experiences probably started early on. And I actually believe that we can have a, a grief experience when we're born, that we're leaving something that is very safe, the womb, and we're born, and then we come out. And a lot of times we do have the warmth of loving arms, but sometimes there are no loving arms.
Mm.
And the grief experience starts there. And people don't understand, why am I always feeling alone or depressed? And maybe it started there. And so
Mm.
it's about, how can you take a timeline and say, gee, let me look at my life through this lens of, where were the maybe traumatic events that might not be seen as traumatic, but maybe they were, even that birthing experience.
Mm.
For me, certainly it was like this question of, like, why am I here? What is my purpose? from
Mm.
from early on. And grief can come along because you've been bullied. For me,
Mm.
I was bullied. I was then very overweight. And those are, align with, just kind of grief and trauma. And they love to dance together and party together and hurt you. And
Mhm.
then the loss of my partner when I was 27 years old. So that was a harrowing experience, deeply painful, and that really changed the trajectory of what I was doing. Before that, I was going to just be a trainer. I was going to train in corporations and about drug abuse, and it was like, no, 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 no. This I got to be talking about grief and loss.
Mm. Okay, so was that where it all started then?
Kind
Your
of yes and no. I think that I had always been in conversation with grief. Uh, I I couldn't step over it, even though I tried. And we have losses that we may not even identify as losses, and
Mm.
that loss of the sense of self
Mm.
is huge for so many, for kids, especially like right now. Not being able to interact for these last 2 years, not being able to develop, or marriages that got postponed,
Mm.
or babies that were born during this time and haven't had a chance to really know people without being masked, except for maybe mom and dad. So there's been a fracturing and a grief throughout. And so for me, I can remember, even in high school, I wrote this massive paper on deathing and dying across many cultures. So it's always kind of been there.
Right, okay. So where's been your soul's calling then, do you
Yeah,
think?
I would say it's been my soul's calling. It's
Mhm.
been something that, if I wasn't going to step into it, it was just going to keep knocking,
Yeah, yeah. The
you
universe
know?
does that to
Yeah.
us. Yeah, it keeps pushing those buttons until you say, aha, this is the direction I'm supposed to be in.
Yeah.
So what are then, so I've heard of like the 5 stages of grief. So what are like those stages? And it's not always just like, I always hear people say, oh, just time will heal, time will make it better. But my experience is that you kind of get used to living with that loss. And you can, there are things that you can do obviously to help yourself, but it isn't isn't really time that helps it. It's the work that you do to accept it. That's what I find. So, but grief isn't always just here in this amount of time, it's going to feel better. It's very messy. That's my interpretation of it anyway. So, what would you say, like, are the stages and the process of dealing with grief?
One of the things that is so often referred to around grief are the stages.
Mm,
And the stages were actually developed by Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, and they were not for people who were grieving. The stages were actually defined for people who were dying. And they were very finite, specific stages, 5 stages that she, as a physician, as a researcher, they were observable stages for people who were dying,
mm.
not for people who were grieving.
Ah,
And it's often that people think, oh, the 5 stages, but those 5 stages are wonderful because Elizabeth Kubler-Ross got the conversation started. And what we know is that we really want that conversation to happen. So however it starts, it doesn't really matter. What I actually talk about are phases, because just as you said, it's messy.
yeah.
Grief does not follow any pattern. It's not linear at all. So because it's not linear and it's as messy as it is, those phases, and the first phase that I talk about is the emotional armor phase. And the emotional armor phase is a phase where it's the go-to phase. It's the first phase. And I don't know that any of us really escape that phase.
Mm,
I- it's filled with numbness. It's filled with, the protest. It's filled with denial. It's filled with hysteria. It's filled with, no, 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 I don't want to do this. And it's your safe go-to, no matter what. That's what it is. The other phases, from anger and anxiety to depression, the 3 Ds of despair, the sadness, the forgiveness, the final grace, they weave in and out of one another, and there's no one right way, and sometimes they get layered. So yeah, it's messy, and there's no timeline. And
mm,
is there a time? No, because I think that once you lose someone, if I say to you, um, accept. I want you to accept this. I'm not a big one about acceptance. I'm about integration. Let's dance with this. Let's partner with this, because it's always going to be by you.
yeah, grief is messy. And so I'm big on acceptance. It's a huge part of my teachings is accepting where you are now, but also not to deny, suppress any of those emotions. Accept and feel all the feelings that you're going through. But yeah, acceptance is a huge word in what I teach and what I do.
Mhm, mhm, mhm. So, and however you get to the integration of those emotions, the acknowledgement of those emotions, that's what matters. There's no right or wrong. And it's great that we all have different lenses, and we offer up those lenses as a way to expand the conversation. So
Mm,
to me, there's no right or wrong. Your lens is a lens of acceptance. My lens is a lens of let's integrate, let's dance with, and my languaging is different, which is wonderful, because some people will just say, oh wow, like, yes, acceptance, and some people will say, let me dance with, and then they have more choices of how to express where they are in the process.
I think acceptance, though, is one thing that comes nearer the end. It isn't because some things people don't want to accept, or
Mhm.
they don't want to admit that, especially the loss of a loved one, someone very close to them, is difficult, isn't it? And then I think, like, but just saying, well, accept that they've gone, isn't that's a lot later. That's not in that raw emotion.
No, right. Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah.
Mm,
So, the counter to acceptance is denial, right? So how do you break through the denial? How do you break through the this is not happening and the resistance to healing? How do you
Mhm.
break through that?
Mm,
And because there's a stuckness that can happen, and there's that resistance, which is really what happens in the cave. We have shadows. We have so many different shadows, and the shadows are, you know, a Jungian term. Carl Jung, who was a psychiatrist and analyst, and he really talked about how we have the parts of us that we don't want to look at or that
mm,
get in the way. And that's really what the cave is. The cave is the place that we 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 kind of have our little battle, or our big battles,
mm,
which with that which we don't want to see, whether it's the shadow of the judge or the critic, or the shadow of the negative mother, or the, you know, or the father, or that which we've internalized that keeps us where we are.
mhm, mhm. Yeah, and sometimes you have to go into that darkness to
Oh, I
meet.
think that actually we need to go into that darkness no matter what.
Mm, mm,
Because the darkness, whether we decide to go into it or not, it chooses us. And
mhm,
part of healing is being in pain for growth. Part
mm,
of healing is saying, I'm going to go into this. I'm fighting tooth and nail.
mm,
Uh, but what I know is that when I go into that cave, I will come out and I will be forever changed.
mm,
And that forever, that being forever changed is really important,
mm,
because um, it's a cycle, and we are always cycling through that hero shiro journey of take the ordinary, you go into the cave, you come out, you figure out, who are my allies, who are my enemies, you know, how do I want to present? And though you might look the same and you might walk the same and you might be the same, the reality is that you're not.
mm,
And the people who might have been around you prior to your loss, they're not around you anymore. Maybe
mm,
because they're afraid, maybe because they don't know what to say, maybe because they feel stuck themselves, maybe because you're not healing in their time.
mm, mm,
And I don't know that there's a time for healing. It's not that grief goes away. The way that you exist with it is what
mm.
changes.
Uh-huh. Yes, yes. Yeah, I think the same about trauma, that it never really goes away. You
No,
just learn to live with it and learn to be a new version of yourself.
that's
With
right.
And I often hear, like, I don't like this saying that trauma makes you strong, and your battles make you strong, because they don't. They rip you apart. They rip you wide open. They destroy you and leave you, with all this kind of scared, anxious feelings. But what does make you stronger is the healing. Do you agree?
Any kind of healing makes you stronger, right?
Mm, mm,
Yeah. Any kind of healing makes you stronger. No one would choose to be traumatized. No
mm,
one would choose to have a sexually traumatic event happen to them.
mhm,
And there are so many parts to what makes us strong,
mm,
or
mm.
helps us to get in touch with our superpowers.
Mhm,
And sometimes it's the brain, and it's the brain can be one of our greatest superpowers. It can be because our brain is an ally, and
mm,
grief, I think, is also an ally. It's one of our greatest allies, because it makes us look at ourselves
mm,
and decide how we want to live, or how we want to live differently, or that we really can't live the same way that we used to live.
mm,
Trauma forever changes us. It's that hero shiro journey again.
mm,
If I It was traumatizing to be overweight, but I was overweight in response to having been sexually traumatized. And weight can often be a way to keep people away,
mm,
or to make me test out, if you want to be near me, it's certainly not going to be because of my body. And so I get to know if you like me because of something that I'm thinking or saying rather than anything that I've got in the reflection of my body. And the healing of that and the vulnerability of taking weight off, which is also a protection, right? And
Mm,
taking weight off and then showing up in the world and saying, okay, I don't need the weight to shroud me or to protect me. And how do we use other things to protect us or
mm,
keep people away so that we feel safe? Because really what we're talking about is safety, right?
mm,
And for some, it might be alcohol or drugs. It might be too much sleep or not enough sleep,
mm,
because you might be afraid to go to sleep because of the dreams or the memories that pop in. And there's this ambushing quality. But if the brain can start to re-regulate and you can start to see some positive messaging around, oh wow, like I
mm,
I was able to walk into a room and I didn't shut down or I didn't run away, the
mm,
brain starts to shift and the amygdala starts to get empowered and all
mm,
this really cool stuff starts to happen. And there is strength. And yes, it's because of the healing, but
mm,
kind of what comes first. And I don't know, it's not, the chicken or the egg, but they
mm,
work together, they work in tandem.
mhm.
Do you find that?
Yeah, I do. So I'm not sure how much you know about me, but I experienced lots of trauma, and I was a drug and alcohol addict from a young age, 13, 14. So, and that continued um, through for about 20 years. And yeah, there I had to then, when I went into recovery, kind of grieve that person. And I'm in the process of writing a book at the minute. My book's called A Pathway to Peace. And I actually, there's a chapter in there called The Darkness Was My Biggest Teacher,
Mhm.
because it really was. Without those dark moments, I kind of wouldn't be who I am now. But
That's
I had
right.
to allow myself to be in that and look, not run away from it, look at what that taught me.
That's right.
And yeah, so it, but it's still, to this day, it's still a dance of, trauma, healing, trauma, healing. And that's what I mean when I say it never really goes away.
No, it
We're
doesn't.
healed, are we? Well, it's a continuum. Um, for me, I have to surrender a lot. As less like just surrender to how I'm feeling, surrender to the moment, and yeah, it's a continuum. But each time I allow myself to be in that moment and learn the lesson and grow, then in turn that makes me feel better for a period of time. Mm,
Hmm. Yeah.
mm,
Well, that darkness is what I refer to as the cave, right?
mm,
It's not,
mm,
and it's not my reference. It's actually um, Dr. Campbell. So, and his works around the hero's journey. Um, and so, Joseph Campbell wrote the hero's journey, and really, we see the hero's journey depicted in films, the Star Wars, and you know, something happens and the ordinary life that they knew is forever changed. We can see it in Superman, we can see it in all of our big superhero stories. We can see it in the Wizard of Oz. It's like something happens and she is forever changed, Dorothy is forever changed, and all of the tasks that she must go to. We
mm,
can see it in the stories of Psyche and Eros, and that Psyche must. It's a wonderful myth. That Psyche must follow through on so many different tasks in
mm,
order to be able to be with the person she loves. Um, and just we are always being challenged to take ourselves on in really, really big ways.
mm,
I love the story of the Wizard of Oz when I talk about trauma, because The Wizard of Oz is kind of a story that we all know, and Dorothy, gets how a house crushes the wicked witch, and she is, given these red shoes, and she doesn't understand that the shoes hold magic, and she must meet, the Scarecrow and the Tin Man, and she must meet the lion, and really she's meeting her brains, and she's meeting her heart, and she's meeting her courage, so she
Mm,
can end up in this Emerald City and take down the drape where the big old wizard is hiding behind, and we see that he's this little old man, and he's
mm,
really not to be feared. And then she has the chance to kind of reckon with her own power, and and that is the grief story. That is the superpower story.
mm,
That is the story that is truly about learning how to challenge yourself, and that every challenge is a grief, is a challenge of grief, and yet is also a challenge of learning and grace.
mm. I've never looked at the Wizard of Oz like that, but yeah, that makes complete sense.
Yeah,
you
right.
you break
Yeah.
it down, yeah, absolutely. So we've talked about like have it personal grief and loss, but how would you then kind of support somebody who was going through it, say like a friend or a family member is going through grief and loss? Because I know that sometimes it's uncomfortable if somebody's lost somebody, they've lost a child or something like that. It's do we talk about it? Do we say, do you want to talk about it? Because often it's skated around, isn't it? That how do we support somebody? How do we approach them to say, is there anything I can do? Can I hold space for you? How would we approach them?
So often when we approach someone who's lost someone, and we're a family, or we're a good friend, we're at a loss for words.
Mm,
And sometimes the intention is good, but it doesn't land well,
mm,
right?
mm. Yeah.
Sometimes we think, well, let me just make some food for them, but everybody is making food, and their coffers are just overflowing, and that can feel overwhelming
Mm,
with these gifts of good intention, but really the gifts are not necessarily what's needed.
mm,
And if we can think about grief, um, it kind of is, it takes you hostage.
mm,
And th- I like to employ the hostage negotiation techniques as a way to help people make interventions, if you will, or show empathy. The first stage of any hostage negotiation, the ones that are successful, has to do with listening well,
mm,
has to do with sitting with a person, and sitting just means maybe recognizing that they're in pain, not necessarily being with them in person, but to listen on the phone or listen through a Zoom call, and be curious, be in that beginner's mind, be, I
mm,
wonder what's going on for you.
mm,
And sometimes it's completely nonverbal, and it's like, okay, I want you to know I am here,
mm,
and I'm here, excuse me, in whatever capacity you need me to be here,
mm, mm,
because I can bring food, but you may not need food.
mm,
I can pick up your kids, but you may not need me to do that either.
mm,
And so, and you may not be able to tell me what it is you do need. So I'm just going to check in, and I'm going to say, hello, I
mm,
see you. I know you're in town, you're across the world, wherever you happen to be, but I'm here,
mm.
and I'm not afraid of your grief.
Yeah.
I'll hold it with you in whatever capacity
Mm,
you may need. And it's listening. That's the first step. If you can show that you're not afraid to be with someone who's in that the messiness of grief
mm,
and all of the different phases of grief,
Mm.
it's amazing what just that showing up experience can do.
Mm. Yeah. 'Cause my experience, it's like, what do I say? What, and sometimes you don't need to say anything.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's so right,
It's
Jennifer.
we all want to fix, don't we? We want to make someone feel better. We want to fix them. We want to cheer them up. But sometimes that's not what they need. They just need you to hold space and go, I'm here. I see you. I feel you.
That's
And
right. That's
mm,
right. And I don't know what your experience is because I've never had your experience.
yeah.
Grief is like your fingerprint. Loss, that loss of someone or something is individual as your fingerprint. No one has the same fingerprint. It's an identifier.
Mhm.
So, it's like saying, okay, I'm not going to put a timeline on you because timeline messaging is like, you mean you're not over it yet? No, actually, I'm not going to be over it. This is not something I get over. This is something in my vernacular I'm going to have to learn how to dance with. I'm going to need to learn how to partner with it, not
Mhm.
get over it. Because frankly, to get over it in my mind means you're asking me to forget.
Yeah.
And I am not gonna forget this.
Mm.
Maybe you want me to, because that's gonna make you more comfortable, but I'm not gonna forget this. I'm not going to forget the loss of my partner. I'm not going to forget the bullying or the abuse, because to forget means that I am dishonoring my life. I'm
Mm.
dishonoring my love. I'm dishonoring, uh, all the stuff, the crappy stuff, the good stuff that makes me me. And
Mhm.
you addressed that, Jennifer, right?
Mhm. Mhm.
You went through 20 years and look at where you're landing now.
Mhm.
And you're in discovery. And gosh, how wonderful it is to be in discovery
Mhm.
of this new Jennifer,
Mhm.
but this new Jennifer couldn't be who she is as she's evolving and developing if she hadn't had 20 years of those other experiences.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly, yeah. And that's what it's been. It's been discovering. And like 5 years in recovery has been like um recovery from mental health breakdown. So like it's just been this constant self-discovery, constant like, oh wow, this is what we're doing now. And I always describe it as, well, when you said about the armor, I was I had I was in survival mode for a long time. I had to fight, for it felt like I was constantly battling something or someone or myself or the demons, and I had a huge suit of armor on. And when I had like a spiritual awakening, that armor fell off, and it was like I broke open and I could finally like speak, and I cried for the first time like in ages. I just broke open and I sobbed like I'd never sobbed before. And then it was that kind of shift that then helped me out of it. And it felt like the last sort of 5 years has been layers coming off until I feel like I am now my true self. And yeah, those layers of armor, the layers of conditioning, the layers of protection that I put around myself have slowly come off to reveal like my true self. And you spoke about vulnerability as well. Then that's been a huge part of my journey and like my clients' journeys, is being prepared to be vulnerable. And that's scary at first, but I find it really empowering now.
Mhm.
Mm.
Yeah. To 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 be vulnerable means that you're showing up
Mhm.
and you're willing to show your best self, as painful as it is,
Mm. Mm.
you know? Yeah. Yeah. And I you've been taking off the armor. I'm in the process right now of creating intensive, like, groups and 4-day, 5-day intensives. And the series is called the Artichoke Series because the artichoke has all of those prickly leaves, right? And all you want to do is get to the center so you can get to the heart of the artichoke. But in order to get to the heart, you have to go through all those prickly leaves, and sometimes they hurt. But and the very tips, the very ends of each leaf they have a little bit of sweetness, and then after a little bit of work, you finally get to that heart. And that is the series of, the Artichoke Series. And that I see that's what we go through when we're along with the hero Shiro journey is the artichoke, the prickly to the heart.
I like that analogy. Yes, I really do. So is that what you're going to be doing? Is it group therapy in person? Or is that online?
Because of the pandemic, all of it has kind of had to go to the background. And I'm actually in the process of writing a second book. So, and the Artichoke Series will be part of that book. I imagine that the Artichoke Series will come out sometime in 2023. And it's not group therapy as much as like a 4-day in-person intensive where 15 to 20 people will gather and we will work intensively for 4 days utilizing a lot of creative methods from clay to mask making, because those elements of process can actually help us get beyond our language, because so often our language around grief protects us. And to get to the more projective techniques like mask making or clay kind of gets us into a more primal experience of what's going on that we might not have words for. So those are going to be experiences. The second book I'm writing is actually called Sexual Grief. And sexual grief is a natural response to an unnatural sexually traumatic event.
Gosh, that sounds powerful.
Yeah.
Yeah, sounds powerful. I'd be interested to read that.
I will definitely send it to you, and maybe we can have a discussion about it when it comes out.
Okay, so thank you so much. It's been really insightful conversation. I hope you listening and watching have got some more understanding about grief. And let us know in the comments. Do get in touch. Would love to hear your thoughts and your responses. So I always ask my guests these 3 questions. What does your inner voice say to you?
You have superpowers. Use them.
Oh, yes, love that. That's very empowering.
Yeah.
And the second question is, what are you most excited about right now?
Writing this book on sexual grief.
Yes. And the third question is, what's the best bit of advice you've ever been given by somebody else?
Your brain has the capacity to change the way you live in the world. Think of it as an ally, and remember that you can change the way you live in the world.
Love that. And who gave you that piece of advice?
It was a culmination of teachers.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Love that. Good bit of advice.
Yeah.
So thank you so much, Edy, for coming on. And it's an absolute pleasure to talk to you. So thank you.
This was a pleasure. Thank you so much, Jennifer.
Thank you. And that's it from us today on That Inner Voice podcast. Don't forget to subscribe and like and share. You never know who you're going to help with the touch of the button. That's all from me today. Goodbye. That was another episode of That Inner Voice. Do join me next time on the next episode. Bye for now.